My name is Dominic Ciminello. I'm a patent attorney at the law firm of Lee & Hayes here in Rochester. And that being said, really pleased to see so many faces in here. Usually when you utter the words attorney, much less patent attorney, you see people kind of running for the doors. And so the fact that you've come in the door and not gone out the door is really refreshing and exciting to me. So I have a pretty low bar on that, as you can tell. But for the next 45 minutes, what I'd like to talk with you about is a little bit of intellectual property, for sure, but even more than that, a little bit of how the practice of intellectual property has really grown over the years, and more recently, how we've learned in the practice to leverage some big data analytics tools to inform some of our IP decisions and to assist with counseling clients in that regard, to hopefully grow corporate value and achieve business goals. So let me start off by saying, to the extent that anyone has any questions on any of the stuff that we're talking about, please feel free to raise your hands, shout them out. I'll be more than happy to answer any questions during the discussion. I'll also try to leave a little bit of time at the end for some Q&A. So, my wife's a fourth grade teacher, and so with that mindset, that kind of informs the slide presentation for the most part. Unfortunately or fortunately for you guys. But a little bit about myself. My background is mechanical engineering. I was a mechanical engineering student at Virginia Tech. Any Florida State fans in the room? Yeah? All right, great. So we'll touch base. Maybe best to touch base after the presentation. Worked as an engineer for a little while here in town before eventually going back to law school. And eventually, after law school, starting to practice. I've been doing this now for about between 15 and 20 years. And it's been a really interesting experience thus far. I've worked for a little while in Washington, D.C. at a large law firm. I then came back to Rochester, which is home. It's also my wife's home, so we've been here ever since. Interestingly, about 6 or so years ago, I had an opportunity to start an office here in Rochester for a law firm, Lee & Hayes, which is actually based out on the West Coast, actually based in Spokane, Washington, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. I was out there interviewing, and it's one of those experiences that, you always kind of remember the wacky interviews that we have. I remember during the interview, we went out to lunch with one of the partners, and he asked me, I think right out of the gates, why should we open an office in Rochester, New York to practice patent law? My retort was, well, why the heck did you open an office in Spokane, Washington to practice patent law, right? Spokane isn't exactly the mecca of IP in the United States. But Rochester actually has some rich history. As you undoubtedly know, Xerox, Kodak, and Bausch & Lomb used to be leaders nationally in the amount of intellectual property they developed and in the number of patents that they actually obtained over the years. So a lot of rich history in Rochester for IP. What I'd like to talk about today and focus the discussion on is a few things. As I mentioned before, the practice of intellectual property has changed over the years, and one of the ways in which it's changed is there are some law firms out there, not many, but a few, and we happen to be one of them, that has leveraged this idea of how can we utilize big data, how can we utilize analytics to better inform business decisions that are being made by our clients. There's a lot of ways in which you can leverage data, but what we've grown accustomed to doing and what we've grown accustomed to counseling our clients on is that by using some tools, some analytics tools, we can better inform the decisions that our clients are making. And so the message to the folks in the audience, who I'm assuming most folks are from a tech background, meaning that that's what this conference is all about, is that I'd like to propose over the next 45 minutes that there are ways in which we can utilize some of that information to hopefully better inform decisions at your companies respectively. So we'll do that first by discussing the fact that over the years, intellectual property has really grown in importance and is emerging as an asset class in and of itself. with that recognition, we'll then discuss ways in which we can leverage analytics in order to build what we refer to as intelligent intellectual property portfolios. Finally, just give you a quick note on some work that we've done in this space and some of the results that we've seen. So, and obviously, as I mentioned, if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. I guess right off the bat, are there any attorneys in the room? Great. An IP attorney? Okay. Well, I guess attorney jokes are fair game. There's only two of us here, so we'll have to huddle up and defend ourselves to this. So why are we talking about this, right? Well, I would propose that there are many reasons why we're talking about this. Two of the reasons that have made it into this presentation are two macro events that we can discuss. One, and this is something I probably don't need to tell anyone in this room, but we are part of a global innovation economy, right? The pace of innovation, not only in our economy, but in economies globally, has been steadily increasing. This is a trend that's been going on for years and years, right? We see this, obviously we see this in the headlines, right? We see this in the news all the time, whether it's Tesla coming out with new innovations, or whether it's Amazon or Apple or Google or Microsoft. On my side of the desk, we also see this manifesting itself at the Patent Office. This is a pretty simple bar chart that I have actually updated recently. What we're noticing here is that with this rapid acceleration in the growth of technology globally, we're also seeing a rapid acceleration in the pace of attempts by companies to protect those innovations. So what I mean by that is, if you look at the Patent Office data, you're seeing an acceleration with which patents are being obtained by companies. Okay? If you think all the way back to 1790, when the first Patent Act was enacted, and use that as a starting point, it took 121 years for the first 1 million patents to issue from the US Patent Office. A long time. Fast forward to today, and particularly to 2018, we just had our 10 millionth patent issue just about a month and a half ago. And before that, the 9 millionth patent was issued in 2015. So we've seen it initially taking 121 years to issue 1 million patents to now we are on pace to have 1 million patents issued every 3 years. Startling numbers. But this certainly is one data point, but I think the data point speaks for itself. There's clearly an acceleration of the attempts by entities to protect their innovations. Macro event number two. Why is this important, right? Why are companies doing this? Well, I would propose to you that, and we see this with our clients, we see this also in the news, that IP is being viewed more and more as a driver of corporate value, right? But innovation on its own isn't enough to drive corporate value. Instead, it's the combination of innovation with protection, right? So we're seeing this accelerated pace of protection, right? The accelerated issuance of patents by the Patent Office. We're also seeing with that a growth in corporate value, right? And there are a couple data points that you can use to illustrate this. I've just included a few here in this slide deck, but certainly there are many, many more if you do the research. One interesting thing is that if you just take a snapshot, past 40 or 50 years, and look at the S&P 500, and in particular look at the entities who, by market cap, own the largest percentage of shares in the S&P 500. Back in the 70s, you had entities like IBM, GM, Exxon, GE, Chevron, by market cap making up the largest percentage of the S&P 500. And if you look to their balance sheets, primarily, typically 80 to 90% of their balance sheets were comprised of tangible assets, right? Very little in the way of intangible assets. If you fast forward to today, certainly you see a change in addition to some entities in the S&P 500, but you also see a dramatic value rotation, whereas before most of the balance sheets were comprised of tangible assets. Now you've seen almost a complete 180 in that. You've seen roughly 80 to 90% of their balance sheets in aggregate are made up of intangible assets, one of which obviously intellectual property. We also see this in the news. These numbers are real, and they're big, and they're real big. You know, Google's purchase of Motorola's IP portfolio went for $12.5 billion with a B dollars. And that's just one example, right? Rockstar's purchase of Nortel for $4.5 billion. Google's purchase of Nest, $3.2 billion. Huge sums of money being paid for intellectual property portfolios. So not only are we seeing an accelerated pace of protection by entities in this country, we're also seeing intellectual property becoming more and more of a driver of value on the corporate scale, right? Whether it's through sale of assets or representation on the balance sheets themselves. So with that, right, if this means that intellectual property in and of itself is now being valued as an asset class in and of itself, certainly it makes sense that intellectual property today is playing more and more of an important role in companies making business decisions, right? So if that is the case, what should we do about it, right? What should companies be thinking about as they're viewing opportunities in the marketplace? And not only viewing opportunities, but also viewing risks in the marketplace, right? How can we possibly think of these opportunities and risks through an IP lens to perhaps increase corporate value and achieve business goals at the company level, right? The purpose of our discussion today is to at least provide a framework by which we can leverage some tools in order to better educate and better inform some of the CEOs and CTOs and CFOs of these companies so that they can make those important business decisions while viewing risk and opportunity through a lens that at least includes intellectual property as one of its components. Does that make sense? Any questions on any of this? So, what is this intelligent portfolio concept? Well, it's exactly what we've been talking about. It's building an intellectual property portfolio, i.e. patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets, where every asset in that portfolio has a particular business purpose and is hopefully being generated through the use of this IP lens, right? Viewing opportunity and risk through the lens of, well, what does the intellectual property look like in that space? Is this a space we should get into or not? Are there opportunities perhaps to grow our portfolio in this space and get ahead of our competitors? So what I would propose to you is that there's a framework to do this. And this isn't by any means the only framework, but I think it's a framework we've been using. And it seems to work, and it seems to make sense. So 3 steps: assess, build, and capitalize. Right? The first step in trying to get companies to think about intellectual property as a way of generating corporate value and growing corporate value is to have an understanding of the pond you're swimming in. Right? So what do I mean by that? Well, naturally, any of the entities in this room, and certainly outside of this room, are all working in a certain business landscape, right? A certain business context. And so you all have competitors in your respective spaces. And what I would propose is the first step in trying to build an intelligent portfolio is understanding what your competition is doing, also understanding what you yourselves are doing from an intellectual property perspective, right? And we can utilize some big data tools and analytics tools to do this, to do that analysis, and to provide that information to CEOs and CTOs so that they can better make decisions at a corporate level. So, a couple of ways. One illustration of this. We had the opportunity back in 2015 to work with Case Western, just up the road in Cleveland, to host a symposium. So Case Western has partnered with us, and as part of this symposium, we thought, well, what would be an interesting way to kind of deliver this message to the audience? Case Western happened to have a portfolio, a small portfolio of patents. I think they have 4 issued patents, and they may have had a handful of pending patent applications at the time, dedicated to this technology called networked neural prosthesis. So essentially, these were medical devices that were implanted into paralysis patients, so folks who had lost mobility in one or more of their limbs. and they were networked in that they all kind of talked to each other, and they all connected to a central controller, which assisted the patient in moving his or her arm, moving his or her leg, that sort of thing. So really groundbreaking technology that they had developed, and they were experts in this technology. They had physicians working on this for many years, and they had obtained some patent protection for it. But the problem was that they didn't really know what the heck to do with it, right? So it was actually very similar to a small or mid-sized company who had some great expertise, great ideas in a particular area. They had developed a really cool, really unique product that was groundbreaking and that was extraordinarily beneficial for those using it. The problem was they didn't really understand what the heck they were getting into, how the heck they were going to utilize this technology, and how could they themselves benefit from it. How could they capitalize on any of the protection that they had obtained for it? So that was the premise with which we came in to assist, and we worked together during this symposium to kind of flesh some of those concepts out. And it's illustrative of this three-step approach that we talked about before. So the first thing we did was we said, okay, well, let's understand, let's assess, let's understand what does the pond look like, right? Are we swimming in a pond that has just a few small minnows in it? Are we swimming in a pond that has barracudas everywhere? Is this, what does this area of technology look like from an intellectual property standpoint? So we generated a data set of patents and published patent applications that were very, very closely related to the intellectual property that Case Western had obtained. So we utilized their IP as a seed to form a large data set of intellectual property assets that would inform us as to what the heck's going on. Is this a crowded space? Is this a space that has room for organic growth? Is this a space whereby if we really want to play in this space, we're probably going to need to partner with some entities who already have IP in that space, or perhaps purchase a portfolio in and of itself. And so we generated this data set, and the first thing we did was utilizing some tools, some visualization tools. We generated some graphics to help illustrate what the pond looked like, right? To help assess the landscape. In particular, this one particular tool that we utilized, and there are several tools to do this, but this one I think is meaningful in that what this tool does is it clusters patents based on semantic similarity. So, to put a finer point on it, it clusters patents based on the technology that they cover. So, what you're seeing here is an illustration that of each little dot here, each little node represents an individual patent or patent publication. And they're grouped together and color-coded based on the area of technology that that patent covers. So you can very quickly see, for this large data set, what is the most closely related to what Case Western is doing, right? What other patents are there out there? Is it very dense? Is it not so dense? Yes, question?
What database or databases did you use to gather that information?
Right, great question. So the interesting thing about IP, well, let's be fair. There are many interesting things about IP, right? I mean, that goes without saying. Right? We're a little bit limited in that we can only access publicly available information, right? So that's the limiting factor, obviously, for any analysis, is what's publicly out there. So the good news is all issued patents are publicly available on either the Patent Office website or Google Patents, or there are some other databases as well, but those are the big ones, right? You can search publicly available databases to understand what are the issued patents in a particular space. You can also access published patent applications 18 months after they've been filed. So that gives us a great deal of, a few powerful tools to understand what's in that space. Now, so that's one thing. The next step to that is, well, geez, how do you know which patents to include in that data set and which patents should we exclude, right? How do we fine-tune our data set? There's a little bit of art to that, as you can imagine. We actually have a staff of data scientists at our firm who are not attorneys. They are literally data scientists who spearhead this effort for some of our clients. And they are tasked with doing the deep dive into the data set to make sure that we're getting the right assets in that data set. So it's not as simple as typing in a Boolean search and, okay, there's 1,000 hits and we'll just plop them in and let's do it. It's much more refined than that. Great question though. There are a number of different ways to do it. There are a number of different publicly available databases that we leverage to obtain that information. Any other questions? Great. So, long and short of it is, through the use of some of these tools, we can get a visualization of what does the landscape look like from a technology perspective, how densely populated is it. As you can see here, we've identified, I'm hoping I'm pushing the right button. I pushed the wrong button. There it is. I was hoping that would be a pointer. Anyway, you can see here where I've circled in the lower red circle where the Case Western assets reside. So this is sort of the focus of this data set, right? But you can see that it's a relatively crowded space, right? There might be some risk if Case Western was to play in that particular space because there's a lot of other IP already there. But you can also see just adjacent to that space, there is some wiggle room, right? There are areas that are relatively close to where Case Western is playing where it's not as densely populated. So the question then becomes, well, geez, is there a market opportunity there, right? If we grow our intellectual property into a space where there isn't a ton of players, can we leverage that type of IP for a business purpose, right? Would that be profitable for us to grow into that space? Or put another way, if we grow into that space, would we be blocking some of our competitors from going into that space? If we get there first, would this make it more difficult for our competition to go there after us, right? So once you understand what the landscape looks like, you can then extrapolate from that what are our opportunities in the space, and also what are the risks that we could encounter if we continue down this path. I would also propose that this can be, and we like to use it as a driver for R&D, right? Whereas typically now R&D is, relatively speaking, reactive, right? We can look at the intellectual property landscape and perhaps be a little bit more proactive with our R&D efforts. In other words, if we understand, hey, this is an area that we can seize, why don't we start investing R&D dollars in this space and trying to understand what the possibilities are there? That might create an opportunity for our entity to grow. Right? So we can utilize some of this information, hopefully as a driver for R&D as well. On the right here, we see what same data set, but we've color-coded it based on age. So what this helps with is a trend analysis. You can tell that some areas that are lit up in red are areas that are really hot. They have very recent priority dates, and so it looks like our competitors in this particular space seem to be focusing their IP attention in those areas, while there are other areas, like down toward the bottom, that are relatively blue. In other words, it appears as though those areas of technology aren't areas in which our competitors are actively pursuing, or at least recently they haven't been. So that could also inform some of our decisions. Right? Additionally, same data set. On the left is the graphic that we've been discussing. On the right, we can also color code this based on S&E. Who owns this stuff, right? In the case of Case Western, they knew about Boston Scientific, Medtronic, Abbott Labs, right? These are well-known entities that have been practicing in this space for a while. They knew that they were there. They knew that those entities had assets in that space. There were other entities that come up on this list that they had no idea even existed. Right? They weren't aware of the fact that some of these entities were playing in this space, or that they had intellectual property that was pretty close to what they were doing. Right? So we can help utilize that information as well to inform us, are these minnows or are they barracudas? Right? Are these very litigious companies? Are they companies that perhaps you've already got a licensing agreement with and that you're on good terms with and that you have agreed to coexist already? Right? That too can inform your business strategy. Another way of performing this analysis, now that we understand what the landscape looks like, well, it's all well and good that Boston Scientific is the top S&E in this space, or that there are other entities like, Abbott Labs or whomever that have intellectual property that's similar to ours. But what if those patents aren't worth a darn? Right? A lot of companies get patents they're not all the greatest patents in the world. Some of them can be very, very narrow, very, very niche type patents that maybe don't really affect where we want to go with our technology at all. On the other hand, some of these patents maybe have claims that are very, very broad, right, that cover a wide range of technology. This type of analysis doesn't really provide any of those insights. But we can assess through some of the analytics tools that we have the strength of those patent claims. In other words, we can gauge on the y-axis here is what we call a scope score. We can gauge how strong or how weak those patents are based on the specific language of the claims that are being utilized by those patents. So we now know who the big players are. We now also know how strong are those patents on average. Right? Are they relatively strong? Are they pretty high up on the y-axis? Or are they relatively weak, pretty low on the y-axis? Case Western wasn't too thrilled that they were one of the lowest assinees shown on this chart, but that's what the data showed. It showed that their patent claims were, relatively speaking, for this data set, for these competitors, pretty narrow claims. So their scope of protection was pretty small. This type of analysis can also help you to understand if you want to perhaps work with some of these entities and enter into a licensing agreement with them, for example, who should you target, right? You can triage this to understand who has relatively small portfolios, in other words, towards the left on the x-axis, but also has relatively high scope score. So we were able to identify a few entities that have relatively high, relatively strong patent claims, moderate size portfolios. They could be good partners or potentially even maybe entering into negotiations with them for purchase of some of their assets. Okay. So a lot of ways to utilize this data, but all of it fits into this first step of understanding the pond that you're swimming in. Are there any questions on any of that so far? So next step, once you've understood the pond you're swimming in, how do you utilize some of that information, right? I mean, these are all great, these are very pretty pictures, right? But that only gets you so far, right? How do you utilize this information? Well, I would propose that building and capitalizing, the other two steps in this analysis is how we try to utilize this information and try and inform some of the decisions that entities are making at the corporate level, right? First, build, right? How can we use this information to help clients, to help startups, to help mid-sized companies build their portfolio, right? We've talked about the fact that some of these graphics can hopefully illustrate to or help us to find or identify white space in the landscape, right? So building the portfolio utilizing some of these tools can be done in a couple of different ways. I would argue one, there's organic growth, right? And there's also growth through licensing or potentially acquisition. If we're talking about building, however, we're talking about organic growth. How can we help clients, help companies grow their portfolio in an organic way? There are a couple ways in which you can use this analysis to do that. I won't bore you with too many of the details here because a lot of them kind of get into the nitty-gritty of practicing patent law, which I wouldn't wish on anyone in this room. But at a high level, what we're trying to do here is build what we refer to as an IP map. Okay? So you can think of the small dots over there on the left. The ones in blue are the assets that our company owns. There are competitor assets in yellow, the folks we know about, right? The Boston Scientifics of the world. And then there are the other third-party assets, so assets owned by companies that maybe we didn't know were even playing in this space, right? Those are all the small dots that are shown on this chart. What I would propose to you is that we can utilize these analytics tools to help us do a few things. One, the larger blue dots illustrate what we refer to as directed prosecution. What I mean by that is, we can utilize some of these tools to help us get our patent applications to issue. So we file the patent application at the patent office, and then there's a long period of time in which we work with the patent office back and forth to try and get those patents to issue. One way of utilizing these tools is through surfacing information as those applications are being worked on, so that we can hopefully get claims that are directed towards what our company is doing or products that our competitors are currently putting out there on the market. So a better informed way of getting patents that are meaningful for your company, right? Patents that issue with claims that either protect the crown jewels of our company, very, very in a focused way, or that read on competitor products, right? That could potentially block our competitors from putting those products out into the market, right? Directed prosecution. A second way of utilizing these tools is with targeted innovation. And I've circled those orange dots here to illustrate what that means. So we can utilize some of this information for prosecuting our own applications. We can also do targeted innovation where, now that we understand what the landscape looks like, let's get a bunch of our engineers in the room and think about, in the context of this landscape information, in the context of this understanding of what the landscape looks like, what should we do in the next 6 months to a year? Where should we grow our portfolio to try and hopefully capitalize on potential white space from an intellectual property standpoint right now to try and block our competitors, right? How can we innovate right now and use this information to direct R&D efforts right now into a space or spaces where we know they're not as densely populated from an intellectual property standpoint? To hopefully grow our portfolio in a meaningful way and block our competitors from going there on the relatively short term. Finally, and similar to what we refer to as targeted innovation, is invention capture. We can also utilize this landscape information by putting not only some engineers in the room, but also some of the marketing folks, some of the C-suite folks in the room, a cross-functional group of folks in the same room, and think about, now that we've understood, and again, this is a timeline on the x-axis, now that we've understood what we're doing in the short term, what if we were to think about this 5 to 10 years out? You know, what should be the areas, if we took away some of the constraints that are currently in place, whether those constraints are intellectual property constraints, whether they're business constraints, funding constraints, right? Technology constraints. You know, what if, you know, the time machine hasn't been built yet, right? What if we took those constraints away and thought about this on a 5 to 10 year horizon? What should we try and protect now that we think people will be trying to do in 10 years from now in this technology space? How can we grow our portfolio into that space now to hopefully obtain protection for technologies that are kind of on the horizon, but that we can solve some of those issues now and obtain protection for them now to get even further ahead of where we think our competitors will be going. And particularly, what's interesting in this analysis is this trend analysis, right? I mean, when we think about not only the technology that's close to what we're doing, but we think about it from in a temporal perspective, what are the current trends? Who's going where, right? These trending analysis can be really important when we're trying to do this forecasting and trying to go after technology that is really pie in the sky type stuff. So a lot of different ways in which this type of analysis can be utilized to build our company's portfolio in an organic way. Does that make sense? Yes?
Where do you focus the efforts on looking at those forecast trends? I realize business magazines and periodicals and such and databases, but where do you generally find the most useful places to get tips on where these trends are going?
So this analysis here, to be very clear, this is publicly available information. This map on the right is, again, the same data set that's shown on the left. But what we've done is we've highlighted that data set based on priority date of each individual patent asset that's illustrated in the
Patent
data set.
documents.
So these are priority dates. This is lit up based on priority date for the patent asset itself. So we can get a very good sense for, I mean, it's crystal clear. It's okay. The ones that have the earliest priority date, 20 years ago, are the ones that are dark blue. The ones that have priority dates that are 2 years ago, bright red. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Now, to take your question a step further, we utilize, and this, I'm not going to dwell too much on this, this is kind of a very rough outline of the process by which, the process that you'll undertake when you're trying to get your patent to issue. Okay. Again, not trying to turn anyone into patent attorneys in this room or anything like that. But there are time periods in which you can change or tweak or modify your claims when you're responding to letters from the patent office to try and get your patent to issue. Okay? Now, what we have done and what we try to do for some of our clients is if we can surface information to the in-house attorney at that company or to the attorney who's writing the response to the patent office, if we can surface competitor information to those folks while those claims are being tweaked at the patent office, we can steer the claims not only to be relevant, certainly, hopefully they're already relevant to the technology that our company is working on, right? But we can also steer those claims to be relevant to competitor products that we see propping up on the market after our patent application has been filed. So we can try and steer the claims in a way that make them not only relevant to what our company is working on, but also make them very relevant to what our competitors are doing. And hopefully, if they issue, could potentially be a way of blocking our competitors from going into that space, or at least being an arrow in our quiver if we ever decide to negotiate with that potential competitor, saying, hey, look, guys, we'd like to partner with you, or we'd like for you to kind of stop doing what you're doing here. Oh, by the way, we own some intellectual property in this space. You may want to take a look at this, and let's talk about it. So there are a lot of ways in which patents can be used in business context. But I would propose that utilizing some of this information during the patent application prosecution process, in other words, while it's still at the patent office, can help us to fill our portfolio with more meaningful and more relevant assets that can be utilized later for any of these reasons. Question?
You mentioned earlier taking a look at the opportunity space in there is one thing that kind of drives where to put R&D dollars as well. Do you also have any data, or do you take a look at data to assess the cost of acquisition of that IP? I mean, is that space an opportunity because it's 100x to invest in it than it is to invest in some of the more crowded spaces? And do you do any analysis on that?
Great question. So to be clear, I think you maybe were referring to this slide. There could have been other slides, but I think this may be one. So what I'm referring to here as opportunity and risk is purely from the perspective of this is what the landscape looks like, this is how crowded this landscape is, and it looks like, and these are all of these nodes are connected based on the degree of relatedness to the adjoining nodes. So that's kind of a lot to wrap your head around, but that's what this shows. So here we can understand that what I'm proposing is that, and what I would propose to an entity that was utilizing this analysis is that we know where we now stand, right? We're in this circle here. We also understand that there are other areas that are relatively close to us that don't appear to be as densely populated from an intellectual property perspective. So that represents an opportunity for portfolio growth in that space. So this opportunity is in the context of how can we grow our portfolio in an intelligent, big data informed way, right? Now, opportunity has a lot of different meanings, right? You can also, when it comes to understanding value, right, if we wanted as an opportunity to grow our portfolio through acquisition, right, or through licensing, we could also utilize that same information, and that's what we've done here, where we're understanding who's in that space, what do their portfolios look like, how strong are they, how related are those portfolios to our own technology, and if they're closely related, pretty strong, and look like they might be a good business partner, at that point we can leverage some of this information, not only to identify those folks, but to also approach them to perhaps begin a negotiation. I think you could also utilize this information, and what we've done in the past is utilize this strength information as one way of assisting with negotiating cost of licenses or cost of acquisition, right? It would be one thing if you were going into a negotiation and the potential seller of a patent asset was saying, well, we want $10 million for these patents, take it or leave it, right? And if it was something critical to your core technology, you might say, okay, well, we'll figure something out. But it's another conversation if you go into that negotiation and say, well, I don't think they're worth 10, I think they're worth 2. And I think they're worth 2 because this is what the data shows. The data shows your patent claims are pretty darn narrow. Okay? So while it may appear on its face that these are great patents, we've got some empirical data, not empirical, but some objective data that helps us to understand how strong or how weak your protection is. And we don't think that 10 is the right number. Right? So this information can not only be useful in identifying those types of portfolios, from identifying those entities that own those portfolios, but can also be used to negotiate the deal at the end of the day. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? So when I say we, I really mean I've been talking for about 45 minutes, and so my time here is just about up. One thing I do want to leave you with, however, is very relevant to the question that was just being asked, which is, I think, how do you use this information potentially to grow a portfolio or potentially to obtain protection for it. We had the opportunity to work with a client who was actually an entity that was, they had developed an app for real-time messaging using video or other content. So we helped them to do this analysis, and it was a very similar analysis to what we were just describing. We did a landscape analysis of that space and quickly understood that there are some very big players in this space, for one. These are entities that most folks have heard of. Right? These are all the SMEs who owned IP in this space. We also noticed that there was a pretty dense population of intellectual property around instant messaging, which we expected. There was also a pretty dense population of intellectual property in the video editing technologies, right? We also expected that. But what we keyed in on was that at the intersection of those two areas of technology, there appeared to be, again, opportunities for intellectual property portfolio growth, right? It appeared as though if we could try and capture IP in the space between these different technology clusters, there might be room for organic growth in those spaces. And it just so happened that that's where their key technology lied, right? It was really at the intersection of video editing and instant messaging, right? It was this technology that dealt with creating very rich content messages in a conversational time frame. So very quick and easy to do, but it could pull in content, whether it was video, audio, pictures, you name it, in a very quick and seamless way. So we came up with a strategy. We came up with a proposed portfolio map where we said, listen, let's try and build our portfolio in these areas. We identified some particular areas that they were currently working on and some areas that it looked like there may be opportunities for growth. And so we executed on that. We tried to grow the portfolio, and we did. We filed roughly, I think, 10 patent applications. We also filed a suite of design cases, trademark cases. Eventually, they were purchased by Apple. And so this is all a matter of public record. I'm not telling you anything that you can't find out. But their app is now the Clips app, available on the iPhone. So this is one example of a way in which these guys weren't a huge company. They were a relatively small startup, but they had a really cool idea. An idea that was really impactful and that in that space was really interesting, and that based on their beta testing, folks really seemed to love the app. And so they came to us kind of early on, and we were able to help them to kind of execute on some of their business goals. So, I'll pause there. Again, I've gone a little bit over, but I'd be happy to answer any additional questions that anyone else in the audience has. Nothing? Okay. Well, I'll be hanging around a little bit later if anyone would like to talk, but appreciate your time today, and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. And thank you again for